in the absolute suffocating darkness that existed before the first dawn ever dared to break, when the sky itself was still bleeding from the terrible wound Cronus had carved into his father Uranus with the jagged flint sickle that Gaia had forged in her agony, when the bronze vault of the heavens still rang night after night with the muffled immortal weeping of the Cyclopes and Hecatonchires imprisoned deep in the womb of earth, when the golden halls of Mount Olympus echoed with the satisfied belches of a Titan who had just swallowed 5 living gods, and believed himself eternal, Rhea, the great mother of gods whose breasts had once fed the very first rivers of the world, and whose tears had watered the first olive trees on Attica, felt the 6th life quicken within her like the first distant rumble of thunder over the wine-dark sea, and she knew with a terror colder than the void between stars, deeper than the trench of Tartarus itself, that this time she would not, could not, would never again stand passively while her husband opened his terrible mouth and gulped down another of her children as casually as a man swallows an oyster. And so when the labor pains came like the first lightning that would one day belong to her son, she fled the golden palace under cover of the blackest storm the world had ever seen, wrapping her swollen belly in a cloak woven from the shadows of the oldest cypress trees on Mount Cithaeron, crossing the wine-dark sea that still remembered the foaming blood of Uranus's severed genitals, and the birth of Aphrodite from that foam, sailing south until the wild dragon-spined mountains of Crete rose before her like the very backbone of the sleeping earth. And there, in the deepest, most secret, most sacred recess of the Idaean Cave on Mount Ida, or the Dictaean Cave on Mount Dicte, depending on which ancient shepherd, which Cretan priestess, which wandering rhapsode you choose to believe, beneath stalactites that wept slow silver tears older than time itself, beneath ceilings painted black with the soot of 1,000 sacred fires lit by the first humans who ever dared to worship in darkness, she gave birth alone to a son whose eyes opened and flashed with the very first lightning the cosmos had ever seen, whose tiny fists clenched as though already grasping the master thunderbolt that would one day split the sky from horizon to horizon, whose cry was so powerful that it shook loose stalactites the size of shipmasts and sent them crashing to the cave floor in a rain of stone, and she named him Zeus, which means the living one, the bright one, the sky itself. And she knew in that single heart-stopping moment that the entire future of the universe, of every god who would ever be worshipped, of every mortal who would ever look up at the stars and dream, had just been born screaming and perfect and terrifying in a cave on a forgotten island at the edge of the world, and to save him from the jaws that had already closed on gentle Hestia of the ever-burning hearth, on golden Demeter, who would one day make the wheat grow, on proud Hera, who would one day wear the crown of heaven, on dark Hades, who already carried death in his shadow, on great Poseidon, who would one day shake the foundations of the earth itself, she wrapped a great stone the exact size and weight of a swaddled infant in the finest linen embroidered with tiny golden bees and tiny silver lightning bolts that would one day become the symbol of every king on Crete, carried it back across the storm-tossed sea to the golden halls of Othris, where Cronus sat drunk on absolute power beneath his crown of harvested wheat and his sickle still stained with his father's blood, and presented it to him, saying in a voice that did not tremble even though her heart was breaking, "Here is your newest child, my lord, born while you slept." And Cronus, suspecting nothing, because suspicion had never yet touched the mind of a Titan who believed himself the final and eternal ruler of everything, opened his terrible mouth that had already swallowed 5 living gods and 1 stone that he believed was a 6th, and gulped down the swaddled rock whole, feeling it settle heavy and cold and indigestible beside the 5 immortal children who still struggled and wept and grew in the darkness of his gut, while the real Zeus was carried back to Crete in absolute secrecy by the nymphs of the night, by the Melii ash nymphs born from the day Uranus's blood first touched soil, and given into the eternal care of Adrastea and Ida, daughters of Melicius, king of the bees, and of the honey nymph Melissa herself, who had once been a mortal princess transformed into a bee by the gratitude of the infant god for her sweetness, and of the mountain nymphs Cynosura and Helice, who would later be placed among the stars as the great and little bear to guide sailors forever, and above all to the divine she-goat Amalthea, whose milk flowed sweeter than nectar and ambrosia combined, whose single golden horn, when accidentally broken in play by the infant god's already tremendous strength, was taken by Gaia herself and filled with every fruit and flower and grain the earth could offer, and became the Cornucopia that never runs empty and would one day feed entire armies, and to guard this child who was the only hope of the cosmos from the all-hearing ears of Cronus, who sat 1,000 miles away on his golden throne, and whose spies were the winds themselves, the armed youths called Curetes, born from the rain of Uranus's blood when it fell on Cretan soil, or sprung fully armed from the earth whenever Rhea wept, stood in a living ring around the mouth of the cave day and night, year after year, decade after decade, clashing their bronze shields with their spears and performing the wild leaping war dance called the Pyrrhic, that would later be imitated by every Greek army before battle, stamping their feet so hard that the mountain shook and loose stones rolled down the slopes, shouting war cries that drowned out every other sound on the island, leaping so high that their crimson plumes brushed the stalactites and sent calcite dust drifting down like snow, beating their swords against their shields in perfect deafening rhythm, so that every time the baby Zeus cried, every time he laughed with the sound of coming thunder, every time he drew breath that smelled of ozone and rain, the sound was swallowed whole by a storm of bronze and iron and human voices that made the very rocks weep with noise and the eagles circle in terror. And there, hidden beneath the roots of the world, cradled in a golden shield that would one day hang in the temple at Olympia, fed on divine milk that made his limbs grow strong as oaks, and wild honey that made his eyes flash with lightning even in sleep, wrestling with panthers and lion cubs for sport, learning the language of eagles and the secrets of storms from the wind itself, feeling the thunder gather in his chest like a second heart beating in perfect time with the clash of the Curetes shields, Zeus grew faster than any mortal child ever could. Until one day he stood taller than the tallest cypress on Crete, his shoulders broad as the hull of a 50-oared ship, his beard already curling like black smoke around a face that carried the terrible beauty of a storm about to break, and his mother Rhea appeared to him at the mouth of the cave bathed in moonlight and starlight and told him who he was, who his father was, what had been done to his brothers and sisters, and what he must now do to free them and save the universe from eternal night, and the fate of the cosmos, which for years had hung by the thinnest, most fragile thread of a she-goat's milk, a beehive's sweetness, and the endless, desperate, beautiful clashing of Curetes' shields, so that a single baby's cry would not reach the ears of a cannibal god 1,000 miles away, passed at last into the hands of a young god who had never known a father's love, but who would soon teach the entire universe what it truly meant to fear the righteous vengeance of a son. And the night the fate of everything depended on a goat, a beehive, and warriors dancing so loudly they drowned out a baby's cry, became the first, most fragile, most beautiful, most world-shattering chapter in the greatest revolution the heavens have ever known. And the echo of those clashing shields still rings in every thunderstorm that rolls across the Mediterranean to this very day.